A man laughed at a quiet passenger in first class until he found out it was Keanu Reeves. What happened next left the entire cabin stunned. Was it karma or a life lesson in disguise? Watch till the end, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more jaw-dropping storytime moments. The hum of the Los Angeles airport was as chaotic as ever, passengers rushing to their gates, voices blending into an indistinct hum, luggage rolling across the polished floors. Among the crowd, standing in the first-class line, was a man who didn't quite fit the usual mold of a luxury traveler. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit or carrying a designer briefcase. Instead, his plaid shirt, worn-out jeans, and scuffed boots made him look more like a backpacker than someone waiting to board first class. That man was Keanu Reeves. Despite his unassuming appearance, Keanu stood with a quiet composure that set him apart. There was something about him, an air of peace and effortless confidence that came not from wealth but from an inner stillness. He carried a simple backpack slung over one shoulder, its straps frayed from years of use, and he watched the world around him with a gaze that was both observant and detached. Behind him, another passenger, Nathaniel Sterling, stood impatiently. Nathaniel was everything Keanu wasn't: polished, wealthy, and painfully aware of his own importance. His perfectly tailored suit, gleaming shoes, and heavy cologne screamed status. He had spent years building a life of luxury and expected to be surrounded by others who matched his level of success. He glanced around the line, assessing his fellow travelers, his expression hardening when his eyes landed on Keanu. He couldn't help himself. The words left his lips before he even thought about them. First class. Ha. Nathaniel remarked, his voice laced with irony. You never know who you'll run into these days. Keanu turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Yeah, he said calmly. The world is full of surprises. Nathaniel had expected a different reaction, perhaps defensiveness, maybe even embarrassment, but Keanu's response was steady, unaffected. That irritated him. He wasn't used to being ignored. Deciding to push further, Nathaniel smirked. Nothing personal, but you don't really seem like the type who flies first class. He chuckled as if he were sharing a joke. It's rare to see someone so casual up here. Keanu just shrugged, offering a small, polite smile. Looks like we're traveling together. Nathaniel barely contained his scoff. This man, whoever he was, didn't belong here. And yet, fate had decided that of all the places on the plane, they would be seated right next to each other. As they made their way onto the aircraft, Nathaniel checked his ticket again, hoping there had been a mistake. But no, seat 3A, right beside seat 3 billion, Keanu's seat. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You've got to be kidding me. Settling into his seat, Nathaniel shot Keanu a sidelong glance. So what do you do? He asked, adopting the tone of someone who already assumed the answer. Keanu, adjusting his backpack beneath the seat, replied simply, I work in film. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. Oh, I see. Commercials, small-time stuff? Keanu smiled slightly. Something like that. Nathaniel laughed under his breath, shaking his head. People always try to climb higher than they should. But let's be real, some spaces just aren't meant for everyone. Keanu didn't react. He just turned to look out the window, his expression unchanged. Nathaniel leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. Listen, buddy, you might be sitting here, but some places will never really belong to certain people. Money can buy a seat, but it can't buy class. At that moment, Keanu finally turned his head to meet Nathaniel's gaze, his eyes calm but piercing. For the first time, Nathaniel felt something shift inside him, like a quiet storm was brewing behind those eyes. But Keanu didn't say a word. Nathaniel smirked, thinking he had won whatever silent battle they were having. But the game was far from over. The plane had taken off and the in-flight service began. A flight attendant moved through first class, offering drinks. Nathaniel, eager to reassert his status, made sure to be noticed. A glass of champagne, please, he said with a confident smile. Something that matches the exclusivity of this seat. The flight attendant, accustomed to dealing with people like him, nodded politely. When she turned to Keanu, she asked, and for you, sir? Keanu smiled gently. Just water, please. Nathaniel let out a soft chuckle. Figures. But before he could continue his smug remarks, a commotion broke out a few rows behind them. A middle-aged woman gasped loudly, clutching her chest, her breathing ragged. Panic spread through the cabin. The flight attendants rushed over, their voices urgent. Ma'am, are you okay? Her husband, pale with fear, stammered she has a heart condition. I think it's her medication. She needs help. Passengers murmured, concern rippling through the cabin. Nathaniel turned his head slightly, but his expression was more irritated than worried. Unbelievable. he muttered. First class is supposed to be peaceful. Then, before anyone else could react, Keanu stood up. He moved swiftly, his face calm but focused. He crouched beside the woman, gently taking her hand. Mom, I need you to take slow, deep breaths, okay? Her husband looked at Keanu, his face filled with desperation. She left her emergency pills in our checked baggage. What do we do? Keanu didn't hesitate. We need to keep her as calm as possible. Can someone get ice water? She needs to stay hydrated. A flight attendant rushed to comply. Keanu turned back to the woman. Mom, my name is Keanu. I promise we're going to help you. Just focus on my voice. The passengers watched stunned. Even the flight attendant seemed taken aback by how composed he was. Nathaniel, meanwhile, sat frozen. This was the same man he had judged just minutes ago. Eventually, after a tense few minutes, the woman's breathing steadied. The attendants took over, making sure she remained stable until landing. As Keanu returned to his seat, the entire first-class cabin was silent. Nathaniel's throat was dry. He struggled to process what had just happened. This man, the one he had dismissed so easily, had just stepped up when it truly mattered. Finally found his voice. You handled that well. Keanu smiled, buckling his seatbelt. Like I said, we all have our place. And sometimes it's exactly where we need to be. Nathaniel looked away, his face burning with embarrassment. For the first time in a long time, he felt small. The tension in the first-class cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Nathaniel, with his polished arrogance, sat back watching Keanu Reeves take a sip of his water, as if trying to decode him like a puzzle. The way Keanu remained unshaken, responding only when necessary, only made Nathaniel more determined to provoke him. You know what's funny? Nathaniel leaned in slightly, his voice dripping with condescension. People who have nothing to show for themselves always talk about things like humility and simplicity. Ever notice that? His eyes gleamed, expecting Keanu to finally break. Keanu, however, didn't flinch. He simply tilted his head slightly, regarding Nathaniel with the same unbothered composure. Then, with a calmness that cut deeper than any insult, he replied, I've noticed that sometimes the people who talk the most about what they have are the ones who feel the emptiest inside. The words lingered in the air like an unshakable truth. A hush fell over the surrounding passengers. Some exchanged quick glances while others visibly reacted, nodding in silent agreement. Nathaniel's smirk faltered just for a moment, but enough for those around him to notice. He cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle. Look, I don't mean to be rude, he said, clearly trying to regain control of the conversation. But the world is competitive. If you don't show what you have, people will ignore you. That's just how things work. Keanu didn't rush to respond. Instead, he leaned back, his fingers lightly tapping his water bottle before finally saying, maybe. But I think true success doesn't need to be shouted about. It speaks for itself. This time, Nathaniel had no quick comeback. He opened his mouth, then shut it. The weight of Keanu's words seemed to settle across the cabin. Several passengers who had been eavesdropping gave small nods of approval, while others shot Nathaniel disapproving looks. The atmosphere in first class had shifted and Nathaniel could feel it. The flight attendant, who had been subtly observing, walked by to collect empty glasses. Nathaniel, still desperate to salvage his pride, glanced at her. Excuse me, he said, forcing a grin, but would you mind bringing me another glass of champagne? I feel like this conversation is going to require it. A few passengers chuckled under their breath, though it wasn't clear if they were laughing with Nathaniel or at him. Keanu, unbothered as ever, simply took another sip of water. But before the flight attendant could respond, a sudden jolt shook the plane. A sharp gasp came from behind them, followed by hurried whispers. Something was happening. Nathaniel turned in his seat just as a man across the aisle clutched his chest, his face contorting in pain. His breathing was erratic, his hands trembling. His wife, sitting beside him, gripped his arm in panic. Oh my God, he's having a heart attack, she cried. The entire cabin froze. The flight attendants rushed forward, but in the midst of the chaos, Keanu was already moving. Without hesitation, he stood up, calmly yet quickly making his way to the distressed man. Sir, can you hear me? Keanu's voice was firm but soothing, the kind of tone that instills confidence in moments of crisis. Stay with me. Try to breathe. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, their earlier amusement gone. Some scrambled to get out of their seats, but Keanu remained focused, crouching beside the man, as if this were something he had done 1,000 times before. The man's wife was sobbing. Please, someone help him. The flight attendants were already calling for a doctor, but Keanu stayed put, one hand on the man's shoulder. You're going to be okay, he assured him, his voice unwavering. Stay with me. Nathaniel watched in stunned silence. Moments ago, he had been mocking Keanu for drinking water in first class. Now, the same man was in front of him, leading a real-life emergency with the calmness of a trained professional. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor on board stepped forward, checking the man's vitals. He's stable, the doctor confirmed, but his expression was serious. We need to land as soon as possible. If you find these stories inspiring and they motivate you to take action, please comment 9. If not, comment 0. Your feedback means a lot to us. Thank you for your valuable time. The flight attendants nodded, relaying the message to the pilots. Meanwhile, Keanu helped position the man comfortably, making sure he could breathe with ease. When Keanu finally returned to his seat, the silence in the cabin was deafening. Nathaniel didn't know what to say. For the first time, he saw Keanu Reeves not as a stranger in worn-out jeans, but as someone entirely different, a man who commanded respect without demanding it, who carried power not in his wallet, but in his actions. Nathaniel swallowed hard. He had spent the entire flight trying to prove he was above Keanu, but now sitting beside him, he felt smaller than ever. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Nathaniel broke the silence. That was impressive. His voice was quieter than before, devoid of arrogance. Keanu glanced at him, offering a small nod. It's nothing. Just doing what anyone should do. Nathaniel let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. Not just anyone, man. He turned back to face forward, his earlier sense of superiority completely shattered. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. All this time, he had been measuring success by wealth and status, but Keanu had just shown him that true greatness had nothing to do with either. Nathaniel's breath hitched. Reeves? The name echoed in his mind, crashing through his thoughts like a tidal wave. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as realization dawned on those who had been quietly observing the exchange. Keanu Reeves. For a moment, Nathaniel sat frozen in place, his face draining of color. The same man he had been mocking, belittling, and challenging for the entire flight was none other than one of the most respected actors in Hollywood, a man known not just for his immense success, but for his humility, generosity, and kindness. The weight of his words from earlier came rushing back, each one now feeling heavier, more foolish, more embarrassing. He had spent the entire flight convinced that he was above the quiet, unassuming man next to him, only to now realize that he had been looking down on someone who, in many ways, stood far above him, not in wealth or status, but in character. He swallowed hard, his mind racing for an escape. He wanted to disappear, to turn back time and undo the damage. But there was no escaping the truth. The looks from the surrounding passengers had shifted from mild amusement at their exchange to something closer to disappointment. Keanu, however, remained unchanged. Still calm, still composed, still Keanu. He offered a small nod to the flight attendant in thanks, then turned back to his water, as if Nathaniel's outburst had never happened. Nathaniel clenched his fists, his pride warring with his growing shame. He had spent his life believing that power and success came from dominance, from proving you were superior to those around you. But here was a man who had everything Nathaniel thought mattered, and yet carried himself with none of the arrogance Nathaniel prided himself on. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Nathaniel took a shaky breath, feeling the burn of humiliation creeping up his neck. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he forced himself to speak. I didn't know. His voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't realize who you were. Keanu turned to him, his expression unreadable. Would it have changed anything? He asked simply. The question hit Nathaniel harder than any of the passive jabs he had thrown during the flight. Would it have changed anything? Would he have treated Keanu differently if he had known he was rich, famous, a global icon? Was that all that mattered to him? Titles, prestige, power? Nathaniel felt something twist in his gut. He had always thought of himself as a self-made man, someone who had fought his way to the top, deserving of everything he had. But now, faced with someone like Keanu, he felt small. Not because Keanu had belittled him, not once had he tried to make Nathaniel feel inferior, but because Nathaniel had done it to himself. He had exposed his own insecurities, his own desperate need to feel important. Swallowing his pride, Nathaniel looked down. No, he admitted, his voice barely audible. I suppose I shouldn't have. For the first time in a long time, Nathaniel felt a shift inside himself, a realization that his approach to life, to people, to success had been all wrong. Keanu didn't gloat. He didn't press for an apology. He simply nodded, his expression softening just a little. "It's never too late to change," Keanu said quietly. Nathaniel let out a slow breath. Those words, spoken so simply, carried a weight he wasn't sure he was ready for. But maybe, just maybe he could try. As the plane prepared for landing, Nathaniel remained lost in thought. The confrontation, his humiliation, the way Keanu had handled the entire exchange without a trace of ego or aimed his head there was all replaying in his head like a scene from a movie. As the wheels touched down, he found himself staring at Keanu's hands rougher than he expected, like they belonged to a man who had worked for everything he had. And maybe that was the real difference. Keanu had earned his success, but he had never let it define him. Nathaniel wasn't sure he could say the same about himself. The seatbelt sign dinged off and passengers began gathering their belongings. Keanu stood, grabbing his worn backpack without hesitation. Nathaniel watched him, feeling an urge to say something to fix what he had broken. As Keanu turned to leave, Nathaniel found himself blurting out, "Wait." Keanu paused, his expression patient. Nathaniel hesitated, then after a deep breath he extended his hand. "Thank you." Keanu looked at him for a long moment, then, with the same quiet grace he had carried throughout the flight, he shook Nathaniel's hand. "Take care, Nathaniel," was all he said. And then, just like that, he was gone. Nathaniel stood there, hands still lingering in the air, feeling something shift inside him. It wasn't just embarrassment anymore. It was something deeper. Something that felt an awful lot like understanding. And maybe, just maybe, a chance to be better. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and Nathaniel felt it in every fiber of his being. He had spent the entire flight trying to assert dominance, convinced that wealth and status were the ultimate markers of success. But now, the truth lay before him, raw and undeniable. Keanu Reeves, the man he had belittled and dismissed, had never needed to prove anything. He didn't flaunt his wealth, demand special treatment, or boast about his achievements. Instead, his quiet strength, humility, and wisdom had done all the talking, and in the process, Nathaniel had revealed more about himself than he had ever intended. As Keanu leaned back in his seat, their conversation coming to an unspoken close, Nathaniel remained motionless, staring down at his hands. His fingers lightly tapped the wedding band on his finger, something he often did when deep in thought, a nervous habit. A subconscious attempt to ground himself. But this time, it wasn't working. Nathaniel replayed every word in his mind. Keanu hadn't scolded him. He hadn't humiliated him. He had simply held up a mirror, and the reflection staring back at Nathaniel was not one he liked. The once confident, self-assured businessman now felt exposed like a child being taught a lesson he should have learned long ago. "What you said doesn't change just because you now know my name. The truth depends on how you choose to treat people." The words cut deeper than Nathaniel expected. He had always believed that respect was something earned through power and wealth. But now, for the first time, he was starting to question everything he had built his life around. A thought sank into his chest, heavier than ever. How many other people had he dismissed like this? How many moments of genuine connection had he missed because he had been too busy judging others based on appearances? He swallowed hard, his throat dry. He hated this feeling, not because he was embarrassed in front of others, but because for the first time, he realized he might have been wrong. The cabin remained eerily quiet. Passengers had witnessed everything. They weren't just watching two men talk anymore. They had become part of a moment that just a others and just a cage. Some glanced at Nathaniel with subtle disapproval, while others seemed to be watching Keanu with a newfound admiration, as if they had just received an unexpected lesson themselves. Nathaniel shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of unspoken judgment. The same people he had once tried to impress with his designer suit and confident attitude were now looking at him differently. And the worst part, he couldn't blame them. The man who had strutted onto the plane, exuding arrogance and entitlement, had been reduced to a humbled, introspective version of himself. But maybe that wasn't a bad thing. Maybe this moment was necessary. As the plane prepared for descent, Nathaniel knew he had to say something. Anything. He turned to Keanu, his voice quieter than before. "I need to apologize." Keanu looked at him, his expression calm, patient. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. "Not because of who you are, but because of who I was." The words hung in the air, honest and vulnerable. For once, Nathaniel wasn't trying to win. Keanu nodded, as if understanding the depth of what Nathaniel was really saying. I appreciate the apology, Keanu said gently, but more than that, I hope you learn from this. Nathaniel nodded, and for the first time, he truly meant it. Keanu continued, his voice steady yet kind. Sometimes what we search for most in the world is what we find least within ourselves. I hope you figure out what really matters. The words sank deep. Nathaniel felt something shift inside him. Maybe for the first time in his life, he was ready to listen. As the plane landed and passengers began to disembark, Nathaniel remained seated for a moment, lost in thought. Then, finally, he stood. His steps felt different. Lighter, maybe. Or perhaps just more aware. At the terminal, he watched Keanu walk away, calm and unbothered as always. Nathaniel noticed how people approached Keanu not because of his fame, but because of his warmth. The way he took the time to greet every fan, smile, acknowledge them like they mattered. And that's when it truly hit Nathaniel. Keanu didn't demand respect. He earned it through kindness, through humility, through simply being the kind of person who uplifted others instead of tearing them down. Nathaniel let out a slow breath. Maybe it wasn't too late for him to change. As he turned toward the baggage claim, Nathaniel felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Maybe this moment, this conversation, this lesson wasn't just a coincidence. Maybe it was an opportunity, a chance to start again. And for the first time in years, Nathaniel was ready to take it. In life, we often chase status, recognition, and validation, believing that these things define who we are. But moments like these remind us of a deeper truth. True worth is not about what we achieve, but about how we treat others. Keanu's words serve as a lesson for all of us. Respect isn't dictated by wealth or status. It's earned through kindness, humility, and how we interact with the world. Judging people by appearances alone blinds us to the value they carry inside. True success isn't about being superior, it's about being impactful. Life has a way of teaching us lessons when we least expect it. Sometimes those lessons come softly, a kind word from a stranger, a moment of quiet reflection. Other times they come like a storm, shaking us to our core, forcing us to face the truth about ourselves. Nathaniel's journey is one of those moments, a moment where arrogance met wisdom, where judgment met grace, and where for the first time in a long time he was forced to truly listen. How often do we rush to judge others? How quickly do we let our assumptions define the way we treat people? We look at someone, how they dress, how they speak, where they sit, and in an instant, we decide their worth. But worth isn't measured in wealth or status. It's measured in character, in kindness, in the way we choose to see and uplift those around us. Nathaniel believed that success placed him above others. He thought power came from dominance, from proving himself superior. But in the end, it wasn't his wealth, his confidence, or his status that left an impact. It was quiet wisdom, his unshakable humility. True strength doesn't need to be loud. True confidence doesn't need to belittle others. So the next time we find ourselves looking down on someone, assuming we know their story, assuming we are somehow better, let's pause. Let's remember that every person we meet is fighting a battle we cannot see. Some battles are visible, others are buried deep, hidden behind forced smiles and quiet struggles. And in those moments where we have the choice to judge or to show kindness, to mock or to uplift, let's choose humility over arrogance. Because what defines us isn't how much we have, but how we treat those who have less. It isn't the luxury of our seat, but the way we make space for others. It isn't the power of our voice, but the wisdom in knowing when to listen. And most importantly, it's never too late to change. We all have the ability to grow, to reflect, to become better than we were yesterday. We don't have to let our past mistakes define us. We don't have to cling to pride when humility could set us free. As Keanu so wisely said, the real world is made by people. And in the end, how we treat others says more about who we are than anything else. So let's make the choice to be kind, to be humble, to be better. Not just for others, but for ourselves. Because when we choose humility, we don't just change the way we see the world, we change the way the world sees us.